know, I always love talking to retired police officers, and this guest certainly no different. He is a retired NYPD lieutenant, a wealth of experience, and also you see him on TV as a contributor to both Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC. Very lucky to have him on the show again, Darrin Porcher. Darrin, thank you so much for being here. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it, Darrin. Appreciate your time. All right, so let me start with the first basic question. With all your experience in your career, the first time you saw this video of Rayshard Brooks, what went through your mind?
Well, it's a complicated narrative, to say the least. It was a tragedy, was the first thing that I spoke to. It was like this was something that there were alternative means in handling something like this. When we take in consideration the use of deadly physical force, it's always a bad thing. I should say it's the last resort, so to speak. So when we had a situation where Mr. Brooks was in possession of a taser that he violently beat an officer to remove, it really set forth. It set something in motion that was like the Titanic, to say the least. Then the officer subsequently was within the range of that taser. The tasers are traditionally 15 and 25 feet. That's the range. And as a result of him being that close, Mr. Brooks pointed the taser at the officer, and the officer shot him. And it was just a bad narrative all the way around for both the officer as well as Mr. Brooks as a result.
What do you think based on the video that you saw, in your opinion, in your professional opinion, do you think this officer is going to be charged with anything, or do you think it's justified?
Well, I give you my experience. I was a lieutenant in the NYPD's Internal Affairs Bureau, and I investigated a lot of these police-involved shootings. And one of the things that the officer has that's going to work in his benefit is he perceived the level of danger was heightened, so to speak, because his taser was removed, and it was essential to take this person being Mr. Brooks, into custody, because we can't have an intoxicated male in possession of a police taser that's roaming through the neighborhood. So it was apparent that he needed to come into custody. Now, the way and means that the officer went about bringing him into custody people can see as questionable. So in terms of this being the officer being charged, that's possible. Traditionally here in New York, for example, all police shootings are entered into the grand jury. So the grand jury will make the decision as to if they're going to indict. The indictment is merely just moving forward with the criminal proceeding in connection with it being a trial, or they're not going to indict, and the officer is not. It's just the officer kind of goes back to where he was, and that's where it stands. So in terms of the officer being charged, it's really going to be predicated upon how the officer is able to drive that narrative of him believing that he was in danger of a serious physical injury or death as a result to the taser that was forcibly removed from the officers in that interaction. And that's going to determine how far that they go. And I'm going to tell you, it may look simple, but this is a very difficult case.
I agree with you. By the way, you're the first person to say that when you said, and you're making me think now, when you said, listen, we don't want an intoxicated man walking or running around the neighborhood with a taser. That makes so much sense. You're right. No, you're absolutely right. You're the first person that I've heard even say that. And I didn't even think about that. You're so right when it comes to that. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with a retired NYPD Lieutenant Darrin Porcher. Okay, so does it matter, Darrin, that we're now learning that this officer who fired his gun and killed Rayshard Brooks had over a dozen complaints? I mean, will that come into play here at all? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the officer's disciplinary hearing history, of course, is going to come into the path of discussion in the courts. That's one of the things that just like as if someone was arrested for a crime and they had several arrests in the past, that stuff is all going to come to the forefront in the trial proceedings. I think that at the end of the day, we still going to have to make the assessment as to were these credible actions on the officer's part, because one of the things that I've heard constantly introduced time and time again is they should have let him go because he was a couple of blocks away from his sister's house. So why didn't the officers just lock his car door and either give him a ride home or call an Uber? Now you're treading in dangerous waters, because now people are looking for the officer to make a discretionary call with a DWI. And I don't think a DWI should be discretionary. I think if a person is observed as being drunk and a field sobriety test was already conducted, you have to take that person into custody. I don't think it's no longer a discretionary case. It's a must-arrest situation.
I agree. Darrin, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just have to. I could not agree with you more. It gets me so angry, Darrin, when people throw that narrative out there. Oh, they should have just let him go. The man is drunk. Who's to say, Darrin, that he walks
in a motor vehicle behind the wheel in a truck?
Right. Who's to say that they don't let him go and then he comes back to his car?
Exactly. So you have to understand that the officers act in accordance with their official capacity, because the only reason why the officers responded was because someone called up and said, hey, look, you know what, this guy's asleep in the drive-thru, and we have patrons that are unable to patronize the establishment because he's asleep in the middle of the drive-thru. We believe that he's intoxicated, and that's why the police came to the scene in the first place. So just looking at the dynamic of the situation in its entirety, I just don't see this as going. I don't see this as going the distance in a criminal justice arena. The use of force is always ugly. There's no good way that I can introduce an officer that uses deadly physical force against another human being. And in the wake of the death of George Floyd, we've now become somewhat hypersensitive in connection with African Americans losing their lives as a result of a police action for a nonviolent offense. I get that, but we also have to evaluate the circumstance or the situation on a case-by-case basis. We cannot, and I repeat, cannot broad brush this into a narrative of, okay, the police are hyper-aggressive against the African-American population, we need to do something now. No, when you do something like that, you will lose every time. You need to spotlight the specifics of this particular case and any other case that either precedes it or comes after it. And then that's how you make the determination of the fact pattern that's going to be introduced into the court, the trial arena, so to speak.
So speaking of the George Floyd case, President Trump just signed an executive order that bans chokeholds from police officers unless the officer's life is at risk. Do you think that was a wise decision? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm all for it. I'm a firm proponent, and we need to have police reform across the board. And the president is at the forefront of the executive branch of government. The executive branch of government is responsible for policing power or enforcement, so to speak. And this falls within the purview of the president's responsibilities in office. I don't think that you should use a chokehold. And just, most police departments prohibit the use of a chokehold. And, in the NYPD, they're prohibited. And when you look at the gross majority of departments, they are prohibited. There are other alternative means of force that you can employ to take someone into custody. And once you start to reduce the airflow through someone's trachea, then you put yourself in a situation where you can possibly cause the loss of life to that person. Therefore, we have to look at this as police are public servants, and in being public servants, we want to take people into custody using the minimum amount of force necessary. And when we look at it from a macro perspective in connection with the use of chokeholds or pressure to one's windpipe, we've had fatalities. Therefore, I think this is the best time, if any, to remove chokeholds from the police tactics as a result.
If you're just joining us, again, it's Darrin Porcher, retired NYPD lieutenant. I'll also see him all over Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC. Darrin, this might be a tough question for you to answer, but I'm going to try to ask it anyway based on your expertise. If you're in that officer's shoes and you have somebody fleeing who just attacked you and your partner, he grabs...
It's an easy question for me.
Okay.
That's not a tough question.
All right, good. Well, then you're the right guy to ask it then. How would you have reacted in that situation? What do you think you would have done?
I would have called you on the air, and I would have got done. No,
you don't want to do that.
What I would have did, No, I don't think I'm a good example for this, and I can give you my answer. I was an instructor in a police academy as a sergeant, so I trained recruits for years. So I kind of understand the dynamic in terms of the progression or the quote-unquote force continuum and what would have been the best tactical means to address a situation like that. But you got to also remember, I'm speaking from the position of being a supervisor with 20 years of experience. Now, when we look at a younger officer that's engaging in a situation like that, I think you may want to look to your other plausible alternatives in a situation. Yeah, and it's a real tough one, man, because this is a split-second decision. You've already been involved in a physical fight, whereas an assailant, an intoxicated assailant, robbed you of your taser and assaulted you. So right there, we have a felony committed against you as the officer by an intoxicated individual. Now, this person is clearly a danger to society because anyone that's looking to assault a police officer is not someone that we can expect to deal with the public on a level of peacefulness, if you want to refer to it as that. So do I believe that the officer was in a situation whereas the use of deadly physical force would have been authorized? I believe that deadly physical force could have been utilized provided the officer speaks to this or he articulates the component of, look, I believe that the individual that took my taser was in the purview of the 15 to 25 feet of the range of a taser. If he was to use that taser against me and immobilize me, he would have a good chance of subsequently removing my firearm. The person, Mr. Brooks, in this particular case, already exhibited violent behavior against me as a police officer because I was assaulted and he removed my taser. Therefore, the ability for him to actually remove my firearm as a result of me being immobilized by the taser would be something that's on the table. Gotcha. If that's the defense that he moves forward, there's a real good chance that he'll walk on that one. But
I tend to agree with you. Yeah.
This is a difficult case. But if you introduce that defense that I just mentioned, the chances of you getting off are going to be more likely than unlikely.
Completely agree with you.
The officer has to he has to create an arena that introduces him being in fear of his life, and that's why he pulled the trigger.
Yep. So, officer, let me ask you this, and I agree with you, by the way. I want to ask you this because, in my personal opinion, if not for what happened to George Floyd and these protests going on throughout the country, I'm not sure this case would have been a national case. I think it certainly would have been covered by the local TV stations, but certainly I don't think it would have gotten nowhere near the magnitude of coverage that it has now. So my question is this. Because of what's going on in this country right now, do you think it's going to be difficult, number one, if the police officers are charged to have a fair trial, number one? And how do you feel, Darrin, about the Atlanta mayor, who I happen to like very much, but she does a press conference yesterday, and she describes the killing of Rayshard Brooks as murder. I mean, as a retired NYPD lieutenant, if you had one of your officers in a situation like this, and you heard the mayor call it murder, how would that make you feel?
Well, I think it's troubling, but not just there. The mayor has taken a series of steps that would clearly create a biased jury pool. For one, the officer was fired without a hearing, and I just felt that this is a classic case of due process should have been in order. The officer should have been afforded his right to representation to speak to what his assessment of the situation was, as opposed to an immediate termination, coupled with the inflammatory statements made by the mayor, which is the city's chief elected official. So I just think that she's really putting her foot in her mouth at 100 miles an hour as it relates to how she's handling this. She's even made statements of, we were all rooting for Mr. Brooks. I just don't think you as a mayor should make statements of that magnitude. I think that you need to let the court proceeding play out, and that's where the rule of law will be addressed, not from the pulpit of the microphone in front of City Hall.
Not only that, but the chief stepped down, Darrin. I mean, what do you make of that? Why does the chief step down?
I don't think the chief stepped down, first of all. I think the chief was demoted. And, and it just goes back to, the inability to allow due process to play its part. You also have to take into consideration this. Police are neutral parties, believe it or not. A lot of times it may seem as if police are biased, but ultimately what an officer's job is to capture the information and present it to the necessary entity, such as the courts or social services. So this, when you make those types of inflammatory statements towards the officer, I think it really it fractures that officer, not just that officer, but that department's ability to maintain a level of impartiality when they're dealing with people on the street.
This is the part of this case that is the most bizarre to me, officer, and maybe in your line of work you've seen this happen before, but this is bizarre to me. You saw the video. 28 minutes. It's very cordial. The officers are very cordial to Mr. Brooks, and Mr. Brooks is more than cordial to the officers. In fact, at one point he says, I understand, I respect you guys, I understand you're doing your job. Everything was so calm, right? Everything was perfect as far as I'm concerned from what I saw. And then in a split second, the officer says he's arresting Brooks, and he asks him to put his hands behind his back. Everything changes. Why?
You got to also remember Mr. Brooks is intoxicated, so we're looking to introduce a component of sanity to an incident that is injected with insanity. Because Mr. Brooks is intoxicated, we can't make an accurate assessment as to what he should or should not have done because he's not in his right frame of mind. So as a result of him not being within a sound mindset, this is the action that he took. I think if you rewound the tape, I don't think Mr. Brooks would have did something like this had he not been intoxicated. And I'm speaking from a hypothetical place, but he was intoxicated. So as a result of him being intoxicated, he took to the actions that we saw in this video in the Wendy's parking lot.
We've heard all the talk about defund the police, and this situation obviously doesn't help that. But New York City actually did start the defunding the police process when they completely disbanded the anti-crime unit yesterday, which is, from what I understand, responsible for gun confiscation and the officers that are in plainclothes. Can you explain why they would do that, and do you think that was a good thing to do?
Well, in Mayor de Blasio's defense, we knew that he was incompetent as soon as he came into office. So as a result of that, this just basically meets the expectations that we as citizens have of Mayor de Blasio. And I use the term mayor loosely in connection with de Blasio. But when we look at how he's advancing the agenda of public safety, it's clear that he's using us as a public in New York for a litmus test for a progressive agenda that's clearly has yet to be proven successful. Right. I've seen a progressive agenda that's been attempted in places like San Francisco, Seattle, and it's been a colossal failure as a result. And so when we look to policing, we need to refer to the subject matter experts, meaning the tacticians in the police department, because they have they have a qualitative understanding of how to reduce crimes in a city like New York. The NYPD has experienced precipitous drops in crime for years, and as a result of these drops in crimes, it's really an attribute to the policies that the NYPD has been using. And so as a result of that, we have to defer to those practitioners and accept the findings that they will apply in relation to crime control strategies. Removing the anti-crime unit, those are the plainclothes officers, was extremely ludicrous because the anti-crime officers are the individuals that have the ability to surreptitiously secrete within a population and just sit there and make observations. And if they see people with firearms or committing burglaries, they can immediately respond. I can't tell you, I worked in the anti-crime unit for years. I can't tell you how many times me as an African-American male, I literally sat in crowds and no one knew that I was a cop. And all I did was I spoke over a radio that I had that was attached, the microphone that was attached to my collar. And I just ran off descriptions, locations as to what was happening. And that being said, I just think that de Blasio just doesn't understand the concept of an anti-crime unit. A plainclothes unit is ever so essential. And it's not just in New York. Nationally, all police departments have plainclothes units. So I don't know if Mayor de Blasio was playing Call of Duty or he was watching a movie on Netflix or he got a hunch, but it's just a terrible strategy. And unfortunately, we as New Yorkers are going to suffer as a result of his failed practices.
Yeah, well, Darrin, first of all, let me just say, I always appreciate it when you take some time to call in. Your experience is unprecedented, and we appreciate you answering all these questions for us. So thank you so much for your time. Stay safe out there in New York. Do you still live out there in New York, by the way?
I still live in New York.
I love New York, man. I grew up in Connecticut, and I love taking trips out to New York. It's one of the best cities in the world. Darrin, thank you so much for your time. I know this has been a very busy time for you over the course of the last month or so. Keep up the great work, my friend. Well,
right.
Keep up the great work.
Thanks
You do a
again.
great job. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Darrin.
That's retired NYPD Lieutenant Darrin Porcher. He says welcome to his world. Yeah, he's on CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News just about every day the last couple of weeks.
Oh, yeah.